Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Today's episode is a conversation, and I'm delighted to be once again speaking with my friend Josh Schrei, creator of the Emerald podcast. For a thorough introduction to Josh, please check out the beginning of episode number 29, because I won't repeat his bio here. I will say that I'm a big fan of his brilliant podcast, The Emerald, and if you don't know it yet, please check it out, especially the two most recent episodes, as well as the two episodes we mention in the conversation that you're about to hear. And also, please subscribe to both Josh's podcast, The Emerald, and this one, or subscribe to my YouTube channel if that's where you're hearing this. Lastly, please listen all the way till the end of the current episode, because this was a really wonderful conversation, and there are key points all the way up until the end. Enjoy. I'm here with Josh Schrei, the visionary creator of the Emerald podcast, and someone who has a deep and broad knowledge of many, many subjects in the world of spirituality, philosophy, practice, Indology, and animism. Josh, it's great to be here with you.
Great to be here with you. Really been looking forward to this conversation. It's been about a year since our last one, so
Yeah.
Interested to see where it all goes.
Yeah. It's nice to just allow it to unfold organically. But let's start with, just a recap of your journey, your autobiography, as it were, in brief, touching on the high points that led you to be doing the work that you're doing now, and what's been most significant to you on your journey, whether that's most significant teachers or experiences or anything really.
Well, one thing about getting older is that your autobiography gets longer and longer and longer
Yeah.
and more difficult to probably summarize in like 5 minutes. But the heart of it is that because I was born into a family of spiritual seekers, I was exposed at a very early age to spiritual tradition. And exposed isn't even the right word. I was completely immersed in it. I was raised in a practice community, a Zen Buddhist community in upstate New York, the Rochester Zen Center. And being a kid in that environment, the adults were pretty focused on what you could call the meditative aspects of the tradition, for obvious reasons. And Zen is that form of Zen particularly is a very meditation intensive practice. But the things that kind of seeped in on a deeper level for me were the stories that I heard and the ritual and the presence of animate beings right from the start. There were ghost stories and stories of talking spirits and stories of nature spirits and stories of the Buddha's various incarnation as animals. And all of this, I think, shaped worldview right from the start, that in which these things weren't just allegory, excuse me, weren't just allegory, weren't just metaphor, but were actual living, breathing, dynamic forces. And then that only got enhanced when we went to India. My parents went to India for a year and we lived over there. And, at age 13, I was plunged right into the dynamic world of Indian mythology and Tibetan cosmology. And, coming from Zen Buddhism, which is fairly stark and austere, to the world of devas and asuras and rakshasas and dragons in the Tibetan traditions and nature spirits. And it really opened my eyes even further to this mythic world. And in India, you see something, and you see it to this day. You see something very rare in the world, which is a place where mythology is still lived and breathed, and it's chanted and it's sung, and it's part, and I would actually argue that mythology, like narrative mythology, does form the substrate of culture wherever you go. It's just we're not always aware of it. But in India, it's very much the way through which reality is mediated is mythic, and understood is mythic, and enacted is mythic. And to be around that just profoundly changed my life. And I started studying Tibetan Tantra at age 14, came back and spent some time in a monastery in upstate New York, and was really deeply devoted to practice all through my high school years. At the same time, I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and in Santa Fe, you're exposed to a gamut of spiritual traditions from around the world. And so, I had a good friend who was studying the Lakota path and got exposed to that at a young age. Many people I knew were deep into Taoism and got exposed to that at an early age. So it was like a spiritual smorgasbord, but it was like a spiritual smorgasbord that actually had genuine lineage practice within it, as opposed to kind of some of the spiritual smorgasbord you tend to see these days, which is a little more, unfocused and dabbly. It was, it was deep and broad at the same time, and I think that that really helped shape my overall view. And there's many, many years, many journeys to India, many teachers who I owe a lot to. And um, it's also important to say that at a certain point in my life, I rejected a lot of it. I went through my rebellion phase. I saw the pitfalls of organized religion and organized tradition. Um, I'd always loved music, and that was kind of the rock and roll phase. And in my life, I had these kind of tug of warring influences, I think, of music and spirituality and storytelling and poetry and all this stuff. And they remain kind of compartmentalized for me until I eventually started to realize, no, this is all one thing. This is all kind of, you could say, one primal fundamental longing for the ecstatic, longing for the conjunctive, longing for an experience of union, whether it's through myth or music or story. This is the experience that has driven human beings forever. It's just that we've forgotten how it's articulated in the Western world. And so the journey towards the podcast was really a journey of weaving the various strands of my life together at last, and also reacting to and responding to discourse around spirituality in the West and around mythology and around all these things that I felt was getting away from the living, pulsing heart of it, which, as from Indian traditions, is about practicing it and feeling it. And, it's an alchemic process, it's not an intellectual process. And so I think the Emerald is my attempt in my own way to help return some of that life breath to mythic discourse. That's how I see it, to bring that life breath back in. Yeah, so that's some of it.
Beautiful. So I'm reminded of an anecdote when Joseph Campbell, the famous mythologist who wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces and many other books, um, he was invited to a Grateful Dead concert because I guess the band were fans of his. And when he saw this communal, ecstatic event with everyone sort of vibing in sync with this giving and receiving between the band and the audience, he said, well, this is a modern mythology. It's just being told musically.
Mm,
So I thought of that anecdote when you were talking about, oh, it's the one and the same thing, like rock and roll at its best, when it's communal, when it's bringing people together into a unitive experience, is actually the same sort of thing. And I totally agree with that. And I wonder where you see modern forms of mythology playing themselves out in our culture, and whether they are, you know driven by capitalism, or whether they still have some power to move people in a way that's that's less superficial, whether it's, I don't know, uh, the Star Wars saga or something else.
mm.
And obviously, any element of any modern mythology can be co-opted into a ridiculously commodified version of itself. But I wonder if you see elements of classical mythology as being significant in modern culture, and what your thoughts are about how that might lead us deeper, those who are interested anyway, into the themes that have inspired humans and given sort of meaning to the cycles of their lives for centuries or millennia.
Well, I think at the heart of it, it's important to understand that human beings have this great longing, and this longing is spoken about in really in all traditions in different ways. And, this longing that drives much of what we do can be described as a longing for ecstasy of some kind, for some type of feeling of conjunctive union, some type of feeling of inseparability, some type of joining with the greater cosmos, some type of feeling, out of my small head and into the communal body and into the ecological body and into the cosmic body, right? Like taken into this place of greater union. And the ways that we find that vary. And, one of the things that's interesting, like in the history of Western religion, is that at a certain point, there was a division made between that which was sacred and that which was like debaucherous, basically. And the ecstatic got kind of filed under the debaucherous. And then the sacred, when you remove that ecstatic element from the sacred, what you tend to end up with, like in, the case of the Catholic Church, is ritual that can feel pretty empty and dry and rote and like you're going through the motions and that kind of thing. And then what you can end up on the other side with is debauchery without any sense of sacredness to it, right? So you have this split between like the sacred and the debaucherous. And, in traditional cultures of, ecstatic trance, or traditional cultures of transpossession, or cultures that engage with drumming and music to take people into these states, there's not a dividing line between the sacred and the profane, right? The sacred and, all of the tools that were given, all of the vibrational tools, and you see this in Tantra too, the vibrational tools of sound, the vibrational tools of dance, the vibrational tools of art, all of these are harnessed in service of, fulfilling that longing for that union. I think in our culture, when I say our culture, I mean like modern, technologically driven, society. I think you see there's a real longing for that state of reconnection, and there's a real lack of understanding around what brings it. And so you see people, fumbling in their various ways to try to find that sacredness, to try to find that ecstasy. And I think it plays itself out in, a thousand different ways. And yes, I think there are myths and stories that hinted it, and there are pieces of art that take us there. I mean, one of the things that resonated about like the first Star Wars films, like you talked about, was that they hit at some incredibly deep mythic themes. And they hit at that place in us that, we're longing to build our stories around. We build our societies around stories. and we do it consciously or unconsciously. And it's far better, in my opinion, to do it consciously than unconsciously. Because if you do it unconsciously, what you end up with is, the same basic deep longing that might take a bunch of people to Burning Man in one, on one side, is also the same deep longing that's driving people to like bond in like alt-right, white supremacist groups and seek that kind of community feeling and that, oxytocin that comes from group bonding and that ecstasy of, feeling part of something and everything like that. And so, like, understanding that human beings need that type of ecstatic ritual, that we have a certain longing for that experience of union, that we want to do it in groups, you know, we want to do it together, and that there has to be something sacred at the center. Once we recognize that, then we can go about kind of, architecting a practice or a life or finding a tradition that allows us to do that. And hopefully it's one that, reinforces the basic principles of interconnectedness rather than drives us into further silos of separation, I would say. So I think at the heart of the human drive, this is there. There is what you can call the mythic drive, and it has to be fulfilled and it will be fulfilled. We're fulfilling it through AI narratives now. We're fulfilling it in all kinds of different ways. But it's not always conscious. We think we're chasing progress. We think we're chasing this. You know, the the whole drive to go to Mars right now, this is a grand mythic narrative that's at play in the world. You look at that drive and it's a drive for transcendence, and it might be perhaps better if people could find that through meditative transcendence as opposed to having to spend trillions of dollars blasting human beings across, yeah, like vast areas of space to end up on a frozen rock that doesn't have plants on it, right? Like, you know, it's
Yeah.
coming from a deep drive for some type of like journeying, some type of transcendence. And that's a natural human urge. We're going to want to have those experiences. It's just, the ancient tantrikas and yogis were able to have those types of experiences while seated on their meditation cushions, and they didn't need to blast themselves across space and rocket ships in order to have them. So I think recognizing what you could call primal somatic drives, primal mythic longings that always exist within human beings and that need to be articulated societally one way or another, that can help bring some like consciousness to the process, hopefully.
Yeah. So you said something that I think is really key, having the sacred at the center.
Mm,
So if we just think about, what's going on and has been going on for some years now at, say, festivals, there's festivals of, conscious living, festivals of yoga, festivals of, music and yoga. These festivals are places where people are experiencing ecstasy of a kind, and there are the elements of the our mythic past, our primal past, whether it's drumming, music, dancing, altered states of consciousness, community. All of that is happening at these festivals, but without some kind of a sacred center, what it tends to become is just another peak experience, just another great moment. But then people come back from the festival and they come back with a car full of dirty things, whether it's Burning Man or Lightning in a Bottle or Coachella or whatever, they come back and it's a big downer, you know, and they were high on life, on community, and on drugs, and on music, and they come back to this weird world that capitalism has created, and it feels like such a contrast, and that they've left that ecstatic experience completely behind. And it seems to me, at least, that this lack of a sacred center is key. because if you have any sort of access to that, and perhaps we can try to define what a sacred center is, although that's difficult. If you
Mm,
have access to that, when you come back from the festival, it's still there. It's still with you. You're you're not just empty. Um, and so it seems like the experiences of ecstasy that a lot of people are having today are relatively superficial compared to that ecstasy which springs from and is rooted in um, something that has been kind of tried and tested over generations. Whether that's, we can give all sorts of examples. You said Taoism. I teach Tantra, but these are traditions that seek to ground people into a direct experience of a sacred center,
mm.
even though it's not something the mind can grab a hold of. That's why it's hard to define, not easy to name, but it's absolutely real. And your comments like sort of gave me a vision of the mandala without the sacred center as typical of these ecstatic experiences people are having today. So I wonder what you think about all of that.
Yeah, well, it's great that you bring up the mandala because that's what I was thinking while you were talking there. From the tantric visionary art and from the understandings of consciousness and the understandings of like ecology and cosmology that mandala structure is constructed around a center. And when there's not a center to that mandala, then the structure doesn't hold, right? Basically, it diffuses into um, exactly what you're talking about. That kind of strange feeling of can I integrate this? And it's acontextual, right? The experiences that you're talking about. I mean, I remember coming back from Lollapalooza when I was like 22 years old, like having had this incredible peak experience, and my shoes ended up in some big bonfire, and so I drove the entire 7 hours back barefoot and this kind of thing, and then it's like, how do I actually anchor this into reality and into my life, And that's something that's talked about in the psychedelic world all the time in terms of integration and people having these like, insane peak experiences, but then like how does that actually fit into our lives and our worlds? And I think this is at the heart of what um, I think it's important for the modern West to be really looking at is the construction of contextual systems, or like what there's been at this point, I think since the late 60s in the US, even before, but really since the late 60s, a lot of kind of freeform spiritual experimentation and the rise of New Ageism and this type of thing. And, you know, that ultimately, I think, is leading lots of people. I see it every day in the work that I do to want something deeper, to want something that has more of a center, to want something that is more deeply contextual. Because, it's very popular these days, for example, to look to indigenous systems and traditional systems. Um, well, if you look at indigenous and traditional systems, like they know where the center of the world is. Like they culturally know where the center of the world is. Each culture will say, this is the central mountain of the world, and they will have that center to the ritual space, and they will architect around that ritual space. And, that centralization, this is one of the beauties of the mandala structure, doesn't take away from the fact that each node of the mandala also acts as its own center. And, it doesn't have to be seen as like a non inclusive kind of centralization, but there is some sense of cohesion. There is a center to the circle, and that center can be, a set of deep core values or principles. That center can be just that kind of, it can be the story and the lore around which that culture is based, right? The common story, the shared story around which that culture is based. It can be a set of practices. I mean, ultimately, if you want to talk, um, in theistic terms, I mean, ultimately, that center is the divine. Like if you want to really get to it, ultimately that center is the divine. And I think that, you know, we've found so many ways in the modern West to make ourselves the center, and it's kind of a natural outgrowth of the culture of humanism over the past several hundred years to like, to center the lens on us and our traumas and our needs and what I want to learn today. And so, you go to one of these festivals that you're talking about, and these festivals can be really beautiful, but it's also like, okay, well, I've got my, cacao circle going on over here, and I've got the Reiki thing going on over here, and I've got the, you know, 100 different offerings, and not really a center. And the idea is, oh, there's going to be Skillshare, and it's going to be mycelial, and there's going to be all these things from different, people, and that's wonderful stuff. People can learn a lot these with that kind of model, and there's a beauty to that kind of model, and it's also worth looking at, like, say, traditional festivals. If you've ever been to a festival in India that really centered around like one deity, for example, and everything was geared around that one deity, and everything spiraled around that one deity. And so you get funneled like towards this focal point, this center of the mandala, and everything, focuses on that center point, and then everything is replenished by that center point. And it's a very different experience. Now, I think, this is something I've talked about in episodes, and I'm going to talk about more in upcoming episodes. I think that just going to get straight to it. I think that in the Western world, there is a understandable allergy to what can be called structure. I think there's an allergy to like spiritual structure, because people have seen, people are rebounding from the wound that has been caused by Western religious institutionalism, right? That has committed, terrible atrocities over the years. And the kind of rebound against that, and the rise of humanism, has taken us into this kind of like, well, I can figure it all out myself. You talk about this. I can be my own guru. I have it all within me. Um, you know, and to me, when I hear that, I hear like the voice of the child kind of saying, like, I don't need any instruction. I got this, and all of us need uh, a, an alchemical cauldron in which to do the transformative work. There needs to be a vessel. There needs to be like the the transmittive traditions of the world, the animate traditions of the world, whether you're talking about the smallest scale indigenous culture, or the like grand tantric systems and this type of thing, they all happen within context, within structure, within protocol, because like I talked about this in a recent episode on power, like that's how power is actually held in nature. Like nature, if you look at like leaf structures, if you look at the structures of atomic structures, everything is held within a mandala of structure, and that structure needs to be there in one way or the other. That doesn't mean that everybody has to go off and join, a lineage and this kind of thing. There's ways to do it without that, but it does mean that there needs to be a lot of energy put towards architecting what you could call a vessel to hold that transmittive power. And it also, like, to organize communally, ritually, however you're organizing, like, it really helps when there's something at the center, when there's something at the center. If not, it's like you end up with circles these days that don't really function because they don't have anything at the center. They don't really function because, you know, okay, I'm going to show up at the circle and represent my viewpoint, and, everyone's viewpoint is equal, but everyone's viewpoint is equal when we're not really invested in the long-term outcome of that circle, you know, like we don't have any set of common bonds that are keeping us there. Like, you know, that circle, it's very difficult for that circle to last. And in fact, ultimately a circle is defined by its relationship to a center. A circle is a relationship to a center. A centerless circle, as I've spoken about recently in a podcast episode, also, like a centerless circle is a very difficult structure to maintain. So I think people are going to be called in coming years, I see it already, are going to be called to kind of move from what you could call uh, you know, a more kind of freeform, mellifluous type of spirituality to something that deepens. And that deepening, and this is important for the Western ear, that deepening doesn't limit its freedom. That deepening doesn't limit its possibility. That architecting and deepening, it actually enhances its possibility. You can go deeper, vaster. You can have experiences of more profound forces. You can develop relationships with animate forces that are deeper and more powerful than if it's just kind of, free-form experimentation. And that's the thing that I think that gets missed. It's like, oh, well, if I sacrifice this freedom, everything for us has to be a freedom order question, right? If I sacrifice this freedom, you know, in favor of structure, I'm going to lose out on that mystic experience. I'm going to lose out on the creativity of it. The creativity is enhanced by the deep structuralism of it. You know, it's like, yeah.
Yeah.
This is a topic I'm passionate about. So,
Oh, no, no. Yeah, yeah. No need, no need to apologize. But yeah, so one of my teachers said something like, if you're willing to sacrifice everything, you get everything in return.
mm,
And we're getting to something really interesting here. It by sacrificing your idea of what freedom looks like and entering into a structure, you actually penetrate to a deeper degree and even kind of freedom. And that's really interesting. So here's the way I would try to precise it. You talked about the divine at the center, and I totally agree. And
mm.
also, the kind of problem is the divine is such a nebulous concept. The people going to the festival say, "Well, we do have the divine at the center," but structure precisely means that it's a specific version of the divine, some specific version. And you touched on that when you said how in India, it's going to be some specific deity that's at the center of the mandala, and that gives the mandala its structure, which then um, makes the event, the festivities, that whatever's going on is dependent on the structure of the mandala, which is itself dependent on the nature of the deity at the center, the version of the divine at the center. And so I think that Westerners are just put off by this. They're skittish about this because the West has become so literalistic. We see it in fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is just literalistic religion, right? And when you're too literalistic, you're like worried about, oh, but how do I know what to commit to or what to engage with or what to enter into? Am I supposed to affirm that Krishna or Shiva or Yamantaka or whoever is the ultimate divinity? And if I affirm that, what if I'm wrong? This is all a byproduct of excessive literalism, right? That doesn't see that specific versions of the divine, instantiated as deities with specific names. They do have specific qualities, and you need to gravitate in the direction that you're instinctively drawn, of course. But the whole point is that each version of the divine, each deity, is an instantiation of the divine, right? And so therefore, by entering into a structure that in a sense orchestrated by the deity at the center, and its mythology, you end up sort of passing through the eye of a needle, to use Swami Lakshmanju's phrase, and bursting out the other side into a kind of radical freedom and openness that you never even dreamed of, no matter how ecstatic your festival or your experience or your peak. um, and you see that, what you the deity that you entered into relationship with was simply a form taken by that which is ultimately formless, but not abstract, it's very much real. And yet, to enter into this relationship, there has to be structure before there can be no structure. Or to put it one final way, the Buddhists talk about the circle whose circumference is nowhere and whose center is everywhere. But to access that ultimate circle, you have to first be in deep engagement with a circle that has a center. And that's the paradox. And when Americans or virtually anyone these days, because Western culture has come to dominate the globe, when they hear about a further stage, they want to go straight to that stage. Okay, the final stage is where the center is everywhere. That's where I am. That's where I want to be. But you literally cannot get there without deeply engaging with a structure that has a center, as a kind of mesocosm to the true macrocosm. So
Yeah,
this is my riff on everything you just said. So what are your
totally.
further thoughts?
Yeah. Are you familiar with the hymn of the pearl? It's a Gnostic hymn from, I think, around the second century. And it's a very simple story. And the story is that there's a boy, and his parents want to pass along an inheritance to him. And the inheritance is this vast, shimmering robe, this mantle, right? This mantle of like great, seamless interconnectivity. But in order to claim that vast, shimmering robe, he has to do something first. And the thing that he has to do is to go on a journey, and he has to go to the great swirling ocean. He has to make his way through the bazaars of Cairo and not get lost. He has to go to the great swirling ocean. And in the midst of the great swirling ocean, where there's this like tumultuous, humming, writhing sea creature, he has to sing to it. And in singing to it, he has to claim a single pearl, one pearl. And so, this understanding of to get to the vast, shimmering freedom of the cosmos, to get to the place of non duality, like ultimate non duality, you know, that the journey there might involve the claiming of a single point, the focusing in on and the claiming of a single point. Instead of just throwing up our arms and saying, I'm already there. Look, I've got the robe. I think that all things are connected. That's not the same thing, folks. I'm sure Harish has mentioned that, but that is not the same thing. And it's one, as you're saying, it's one of the primary mistakes that people, when they encounter non-dual traditions, make. Said, "Oh yeah, I'm already in the oneness." Well, yes, ultimately we are all already in the oneness. Ultimately, but ultimately is ultimately, and we surf the waves of duality, and it's very much like the way that consciousness itself works, which is so somatically related to thousands of years of evolution and like the process of hunting and tracking, like the ability to hone our rapturous attention. And there's something really interesting about the word rapture, with which is that rapture means to be like totally focused, right? Rapt attention. It means like to be totally focused, and then it also wrapped like a raptor. It means to be taken totally away, right? So you've probably had experiences like in a meditative state or a flow state, those who are listening, of having this kind of like funneling towards a point, but then at the same time expanding into an expansive whole. And that's an indication that if we want to get to that space of the expansive whole, we have to learn to funnel towards a specific point. And to your point, not just a point that is kind of generally speaking the universe, you know, and I'll use that language to try and kind of work with people in the Western world, but I also really deeply encourage people to find a very specific point of devotion, point of practice, point of, concentration, because the specificity and detail of that point is very important. And yeah, like you're saying, I mean, this is one of the beauties of Indian tradition is that you can, you know, you can be doing a practice, you read the Lalita Sahasranama and you're like, there, she is the creatrix of the entire universe and she is the source and she is the ultimate deity. And then, you turn to another text and it's, the names are proclaiming another deity that, and the modern mind, like in that literalistic way, wants to go, well, who's right? Who's the actual creator? And the point is that you find that Ishta Devata, you find that like that deity that you resonate with deeply, whose attributes you resonate with deeply, and you focus on it, and you focus on it in glorious loving detail. And this is also like in some of these traditions the beauty of what like ornaments are for in the tantric traditions, your ability to hone in on the bangles and the earrings and the hair of the divine and all of this detail, this loving detail, because ultimately what you want is a relationship with the divine that is as textured and nuanced and deep and intricate and real as your relationship with your lover or your best friend, or and um that's hard to do if the vision of the divine is just generality. And it's also like that's part of like the modern wound. Like that's part of that kind of focus on just like transcendentalism, transcendence. You know, loving Shakti means like loving the details. It means like loving the actual periphery of the mandala and the center and all the ways it manifests and all the interrelationalities, and all of that is Shakti. All of it and in its play is Shakti. And so to me, it's like we're called into a real relationality and a specificity. And, that to me also reinforces, and maybe we can get into this too, reinforces, you were asking before we started about animism and why animism is so important. That it reinforces the need for an understanding of the aliveness of everything. And yeah.
Yeah, okay. So before we get there, um, in non dual Tantra, one way that we talk about deities is that they are icons of our own essence nature.
Mm,
That each deity is an icon of your own essence nature, which is multifaceted. It's a single essence nature, but like a diamond, which is a single diamond, it has many facets. And so each deity reflects back to you some aspect or multiple aspects of your own essence nature. So then people say, well, if that's the case, why do I need a deity, right? And the answer is because you don't know your essence nature, because you need to enter into this profound relationship with a mirror. The deity is a mirror to what you are on the deepest level that you don't actually know to be the case. And to your point, everyone is already God. But if you don't experience your divinity, the fact that you are already that with a capital T is irrelevant. It's immaterial, right? Because then it's just an intellectual fact. Yeah, I believe these teachings that say we are all already perfectly divine, just as we are, and it feels good to affirm that as a thought. Oh, I'm perfect just as I am, but that's not even remotely close to actually experiencing that which you are. and there has to be a path to that experience. And so in the tantric tradition and many other traditions, it's deity yoga is a big part of that, where you're engaging with this icon of essence that is constantly showing you how you are misunderstanding or underestimating yourself, you know. And that can also be a difficult process, right? Because it requires the stripping away of the self images that you are clinging to that prevent you from experiencing the depth and expansive beauty of what you actually are. And so that's absolutely key, that you and we're making a critique here, which I think is a very needed and good critique of those who are, whose spirituality invokes phrases like the universe, or the divine, with no specificity at all. Because as long as they are only invoking these vast generalities, they can also effectively sort of hide from whatever they want to hide from, avoid the divine mirror, um, and keep things superficial. And it feels good. It feels good to be in superficial spirituality, but it's ultimately unfulfilling. It ultimately becomes no different than, watching a good TV show that entertains you, but then you're not given anything that is lasting by it.
Yeah.
What?
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I've been around the spiritual world for a long time, like my entire life. And I'm sure you've seen this too, and I'll just say it very directly. I've seen people who literally use the understanding that I'm perfect just the way I am, or I'm already divine, like literally use it as an excuse to keep being jerks and not do any work on themselves. Like, if you want to get down to like the heart of it, it's like, you know, it's like, and to me it speaks to, and what you were saying at the end there, like, really, I think that for the wounded modern world, which has gone so far down this path of isolated individualism, we have to be called into relationality. We have to ultimately be called into relationality. And so I don't know how, for either the person who is suffering from like a deep lack of self esteem or someone who's in the realm of self aggrandizement, the teaching that you're all already divine and you're already perfect the way you are can serve to simply like reinforce like um individual senses of self and self-aggrandizement and this kind of thing that really take us away from ultimately the relationality that is at the heart of existence. I mean, people can claim anything they want about what they're experiencing, all this thing, and the real measure is in like, okay, well, how's it going with your friends, and how's it going in your actual heart to heart relationships with people, and how's the actual process of navigation of life going, and like, if you're in an intentional community, like, would the rest of the community agree that you're already perfect the way you are? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
actually that guy spends a lot of time not doing the dishes, and like, it's all about that relationality. And so this is, again, this kind of leads into this animist discussion, and we can take something like Kundalini, for example. It's like a person's approach to something like Kundalini is going to be very different if basically what they understand it to be is some type of solely and completely isolated individual experience that happens free of any type of communal or ecological context, right? Whereas, in the cultural traditions where it's been practiced, the yogic traditions, and even like the living traditions in places like Nepal, where you see that it's part of an overall ritual ecosystem, it's part of an overall communal ecosystem, it's part of an overall ecological system. I mean, I was talking with Frederick Smith, and he was talking about transpossession in village India, and how, one day the deity chooses this person and the next day the deity chooses that person. And it's all for the life of the village. It's not for like one person getting to be like, hey, I had a Kundalini awakening and I'm special, right? Like, so I feel that in order for modern individualist minds to come into relationality, our practice has to be more than just like, hey, I'm accepting that I'm already the ocean and I'm already the infinite and I'm already. It has to be anchored in a lot more relationality than that. And that can happen in a lot of different ways. But one of the ways it happens is through externalizing or iconizing, as you're saying, and I'm not sure that's even a word, but I'm using it as a word, right?
Yeah.
So, like establishing that center point to which we are offering that loving devotion, you know, and then like it's also important in that whole navigation to really look at like, you know, yes, ultimately the consciousness that flows through me is inseparable from and connected to the vast infinite consciousness of the universe. And so I am the universe expressing itself through a certain set of eyes, you know, but also like to take it into kind of the devotional traditions, like there are times, when I stare across the ocean, we got like a big tsunami warning in Hawaii here the other week. And, this didn't turn out to be a huge event, but you could see these big movements of the ocean, and you look up at the stars, and like that feeling of we're vast is important, but that feeling of we're small is also really important too. It's really important to the spiritual journey to feel like, wow, in this current form, I'm gonna exist like what 80 100 years, and then there's going to be a big transition, right? And like, you know and I'm surrounded by and permeated with vast forces and connecting to and understanding them, and and invoking my appreciation and gratitude, and um acknowledging the guardians and protectors, and acknowledging you know the source of life itself. That all of these things have been seen as so important to tradition. We can't lose that in favor of just kind of an individual want for the ultimate experience.
Yeah.
The relational is where we navigate. How much I think I heard you talk about one time about like, can't remember whether it was Namkai Norbu or one of the grand meditation masters being asked about how long he actually spends in kind of the thoughtless state out of an hour meditation, and he said something like 2 minutes or something like that. And understanding that, okay, we do have these experiences in which we dissolve into the oneness, but we're also spending so much of our time navigating intermediary forces, navigating relationality, navigating this type of thing, that our practice has to be anchored around that as well.
Yeah, here we're coming to something hugely important that I really did want to talk about, which is our modern culture, especially in the West, is utterly obsessed with individuality. My individual story, my individual journey, my specialness or lack thereof. If you're convinced that you're a piece of shit, or that you are more traumatized than someone else, you're still special. You're just trying to be special by being shittier or more traumatized, right? So this is so crucial because in both of the ways that the traditions, all the indigenous traditions invite us to be, both transcend individuality. Because as an organism, as a human organism, we are 100% relational. We are not even slightly independent, right? We're completely dependent on everything, and it's a giving and a receiving and a relational flow that in which the individual is such a tiny, tiny, tiny piece, right? And so it gives us humility if we become aware of what's going on, of how relational, how interdependent we actually are, and that we're called to honor that relationality, and that interdependence. And you mentioned about, like, in your community, what do your friends think or whatever. Like, here's a great question. Ask everyone you know, have I made a truly positive impact on your life? Have I made more of a positive impact than a negative one? That's one way of, like, assessing the reality of your relationality instead of your fever dream of your specialness, which usually prevents people from acting in truly beneficial ways within community, right? And then in terms of the vastness, right? In terms of the vastness of what you ultimately are, it's just to say that you are the whole. As an organism, you're a tiny, tiny part. And as at the depths of your being and your fundamental nature, you are the whole. You are the absolute whole. But that also is completely transcendent of individuality. So the you know the clinging to
Yep.
individuality can
Either
destroy.
way,
Yeah,
either way, you're not going to get the like ego boost that you're looking for.
either way, that's exactly it. And something I'm struck with, or struck by in animism and some of what you've shared, is how people in these traditional cultures, they knew this. They didn't have the attachment to individuality that we have. Like, there was this one example you gave which always stuck with me, of, I don't exactly remember the details, but if I get something wrong, you can correct me. Of the in Hawaii, when the people would carry a few people, a handful of people would carry the king's body when the king had died to a special cave for his interment. They would carry him there and inter him in that cave, and then they would leap into the ocean and die, having fulfilled their purpose. And that's such an interesting, important example, because here, these are people who are obviously not attached to some story of my individual journey and how is this serving me. They know that they're part of a bigger whole. And I'm not saying that the cultural practice is good or laudable or anything like that, or I'm not saying it's bad either. It's just to point to a whole different way of being, where people experience themselves so much as part of a whole that the life and death of an individual body was not as important as being intimately interwoven with the whole pattern of things. And that's something incredibly profound that I think people need to hear more about. Did I get the story more or less right there?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring it up because I was just talking about that place the other day because my wife just sea kayaks right by there. It's right here on the north shore of the island that I live on, and yeah, the people who placed the remains of the king in that place. It was a great honor for them to give themselves over to that place, and that place has a vibration to it. That place, the sea cliff and the big sea arch and the waterfall and the color of the water there, like it has a real power to it. And I use examples like that because yeah, again, you don't have to like say, yeah, the human sacrifice is great, right? But to poke away at the modern Western individualist mind a little bit and say, can you imagine, like, for in an individualist world, that's the last thing you can imagine, But then you see the flip side of that, and you see how prevalent, people taking their own lives is these days too. And that is, to me, is a disease of individuality also. That's the flip side of it, and that's also a disease of individuality. And this is like, it's the isolated road that individuality ultimately takes on when people feel so distanced from the collective, you know, to feel so much a part of the collective that one would be willing to give their own life for it. Um, there's a beautiful story that was just told to me by Beverly Cook, who's a chief in the Mohawk Nation and in the Iroquois um, Confederacy, and of Sky Woman falling to Earth, and it's like this incredible creation story. And as she falls, all these various beings exhibit their relational participation in the process of creation. So she falls, and the turtle rises to greet her. She's pregnant at the time, and she falls, and the turtle rises to greet her. And the animals see that she needs a soft place to land on the turtle's back, and so they all dive into the ocean. There's only sea creatures there at that point, so they all dive into the ocean to find some mud to make the bed softer for her to fall. And the otter, who everyone loves, like the otter and the beaver and these types of creatures, they dive and dive and dive, but they can't find any of that mud. And the little lowly muskrat finds his way all the way to the bottom and brings up the mud to break her fall. And the muskrat dove too deep, and he ends up dying, and he dies in the process. And the muskrat is like the little lowliest of the creatures, as Beverly described it. And here is this, kind of creature that we don't give a lot of credit to, who's willing to give his own life to offer some earth so that Sky Woman's fall might be softer. And this is like the gift of relationality, the gift of that social web, the gift of that true celebration of interconnectivity. And within a system like that, for one life to come and go isn't the ultimate question. The ultimate question is much more the continuity of relationship, and that continuity of relationship is not always focused on us. To get to your kind of inquiry into individuality, one of the things that you see so often these days is people treating their viewpoints and their thoughts and their feelings as if they were like property ownership. Basically, not only do I own this thing, I absolutely totally self identify with it. And, this is an interesting place where, you know, you could say like ancient traditions meet like modern identity politics and this kind of thing, because yes, you can see the importance and value of you know, um, like having a story to share and really deepening into like, oh, this is my story. You know, and at the same time, like in an animate perspective, feelings aren't property. Feelings come from somewhere. Thoughts even come from somewhere, and they're agreements, and they're relational, and they're not mine necessarily. And they pass through us, like waters or winds through a canyon, and, what to give voice to and what to let pass on. There's feelings that it's really important to honor, and there's feelings that's also really important to pass on. There's feelings that it's important to not get attached to and to be like, no, this isn't me. And this has a lot to do with the fact that I'm tired, or I was up late last night, and I'm really grouchy this morning, and so all this like agitation that's coming, like this is an energetic pranic bubbling up, and it's not something that I have to like you know, claim as my individual property or like stake my identity on and this kind of thing. And that type of work, it's important as we navigate feeling. You don't want to be suppressing feeling like in a bottle, right? But it's also possible to dwell on feeling. It's also possible to get caught in like a whirlpool and linger way too long in certain feeling. And so, again, from an animate perspective, all of this is Shakti, all of this is energy, all of this is the five pranas moving, all of this is the movement of actual tangible forces. And so the navigation of life is less about that kind of analysis of individual feeling and much more about the actual practice of navigating the oceans of feeling.
And the point is, to me, that there actually is no individual feeling. That which you're taking to be your individual feeling is literally crafted by and caused by your total environment, your total cultural environment, intellectual environment, ecological environment, uh, e- on every level. So everything that you're experiencing as an organism is a product of the environment, and therefore, what a bizarre thing to, these are my feelings, these are my thoughts. You know, when you look at it, ownership is literally a mental construct. There's no such thing as ownership in nature, right? So the very phrase, my feelings, is nonsensical from a point of view that's privileging that which is undeniably true in nature, as opposed to validating every thought that arises. And the latter is clearly an incoherent view, because if you're validating every thought that arises, in no time you're hopelessly confused,
Mm.
because all the thoughts are contradictory. There is no coherent center to the thought world whatsoever. And so, if we want to be grounded in something, if we want to be sane, we turn to nature and that which is undeniably true in nature. And ownership is not one of the features of nature, right? So
Yeah.
therefore, that. Okay, go ahead.
Well, sorry. And it also suggests, like, and I think this is really key in this day and age too, that if you want to work on yourself and your own, your quote unquote self and your own mind and your own waves of feeling, work within your environment, work within what's around you. And again, this relates to what you're talking about, externalizing the deity and this type of thing. Like, we are a product of the ecology that surrounds us. And by ecology, I don't just mean the plant life, though that's a huge part of it, but I mean, yes, the environmental ecology, but I mean, every possible layer of that. And so, like, all of the relational practices that exist, say, in Buddhism, for example, or in Hinduism or Hindu Tantra, you know, all the practices that exist even in the mindfulness traditions, which are so meditative, they have so much relational practice. There's so much focus on extending the web and connecting beings through the chanted words that are spoken and through the structure of the shrine that you create and how you work with the ritual space and how you keep that ecology is going to absolutely and positively feed into, like, how you keep the outer ecology is going to feed into how your inner ecology feels. And part of the issue that we face, and I spoke to this a lot in an episode called "The Revolution Will Not Be Psychologized," but a part of the issue that we face in the modern West is that we try to tackle what we see as individual problems only through the means of working with them within ourselves individually, and that just isn't how things move. It's not how things pass through us. Things are relational. You have to work with things relationally. If you want movements to happen inside you, how is that movement going to happen if it's just you trying to think your way out of the pattern or even talk your way out of the pattern? I mean, talking can be helpful, yeah, but like, working to create, an ecological construct, working to create a ritual space, working to create a ritual practice, working to adhere to some type of, festival calendar throughout the year or regular times of honoring and this type of thing. This is all quote unquote self work, even though it is externalized ritual work, because it establishes us in relation to ecology in a different way. And so you know, and I did an episode called "Why Mindfulness Isn't Enough," specifically because I don't think that for modern Western minds, it's enough of a practice for individualized minds to simply just sit on the meditation cushion and focus on themselves. I think there has to be relationality built into the practice, because if not, it's just reinforcing that isolationist tendency.
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest theme that runs through the Emerald podcast, and you've mentioned, episodes that I absolutely love, like the like the revolution will not be psychologized. That's one of my top 5 favorites, I think. Um, and this podcast is just amazing, even in the wider sphere of podcastistan, right? Because it's an artistic creation. It's brilliantly insightful, and it makes arguments, and it has points, right? But it's also poetic. It's also a soundscape. You create literally an incredible soundscape that includes singing and music and poetry and sound effects and spoken word, interwoven with philosophical, we could say, reflections, existential reflections. And I mean, as far as I know, there's nothing else quite like it. Of course, there's podcasts out there using sound effects and dramatic stuff, but you are creating something that is equal parts poetic and artistic and intellectual and thought provoking, and that is almost unique. And one of the through lines, of course, is animism, the vision of the universe as utterly animate, where everything has life force, or everything has a spirit to it, which of course is also part of the tantric view. It's also part of, maybe every indigenous view. And what I'm wondering is, like, how can you make this point of view understandable or palatable to the modern human who just has no experience of animacy in anything other than their friends and their pets? You know what I mean? Like, the the world for many modern humans, and the universe, is primarily unconscious, inert, a cold, dead universe primarily, instead of a universe absolutely brimming with life, where everything and anything can speak to you, from a river to a tree to a stone. How do you make that animistic view? Um, how do we get it across to people for whom it is just wishful thinking or magical thinking or delusion of some kind? How do we bring the animist view, which is at the very least closer to reality than the modern materialist view? How do we make it sensical, um, and not just a lovely fantasy?
Yeah. Um, I think first it's important to recognize that the word animism is a modern construct that only exists because a particular, group of human beings drifted away from what has been the absolute foundational matrix of how human beings have experienced the world forever, right? For hundreds of thousands of years across every single cultural tradition, there is an understanding of inhabiting a living world, of consciousness and agency and vibrancy with which we are in deep and intimate relation. And so you only need the word animism if you've somehow drifted away from animism. So colonial anthropologists came up with the word animism to describe that thing that they saw everywhere they went. Right? Absolutely everywhere they went. That's what they found. So, we better call it animism. But really, what it is the natural way of perceiving and interacting with the world. Interacting, why would we not want to interact with the world, from, in the same way that we would interact with each other? Of course we do, because when we're living close to, ecology, we recognize our complete and total interdependence. We recognize that, the river impacts us, and the trees impact us, and the health of the life of the ecosystem impacts us, and that we're bound to this, and that, you know everything exhibits qualities of personhood. The more closely you look, you see personhood everywhere. And that doesn't mean, again, you're talking about religious literalism earlier. That doesn't mean rocks have mouths and open up and talk and, take enough entheogens and they might, but that's a whole other topic. But, things exhibit personhood in that, you know, they, they pulse with life. There's a natural flow to the seasons. There's a natural flow to the cycle of the moon. And the more that we look, those pulses and those flows exist everywhere. There's a pulse to the river. If you look at all the relationships that a river has, all the creatures that benefit from it, everything, there's a pulse to it, a pulse of life. And that pulse is easily felt within us. And so, I don't go about trying to, like, quote unquote convince people to, like, become animists and, you know, in the space of, like, intellectual conversation about it. But I think it's worth reminding us as human beings that this is the foundational way that we've always seen and interacted with the cosmos. It's always been that way. And why has it always been that way? Well, if 99.999999999% of our ancestors, felt this way about the world, we can take some pretty simple Occam's razor, approaches to that and say, well, maybe they're onto something. If we anoint ourselves, like, in the last 300 years, really, like, in the last 300 years, oh, we're really the ones who got it right. We're really the ones who got it right. Yeah, that's a lot of cultural hubris.
Yeah.
Like, really, and, think about 300,000 years of human history. Think about, saying to, like, you know, the the Aboriginal elder or the Iroquois chief or the Celtic druid or oh, no, you guys got it all wrong. Your 100, your 1,000 generations of people, you got it all wrong. We're the ones who have the absolute lock on what reality is. And, by the way, our society happens to be a mess and we're anxious and isolated and we're busily destroying the planet. But you guys are the ones who got it wrong. you know, it's just like, let's look at where we are and let's look at where the path divorced from relationality has gotten us. And Wade Davis says this very simply, where he says, like, look, whether or not you ultimately feel, you know, that consciousness within all things and this type of thing, you're going to treat a mountain very differently if you regard it as the center of life versus if you regard it as a dead object whose only value is if you cut the trees off of it and sell it, right? And that alone, I think, should spark some interest in in modern human beings, some purely self-preservational interest in modern human beings, to see that no, our dependence, our survival depends on us cultivating this deeper relationality. Now, because I know, I'll just say one quick thing. I know that you're kind of willing to go here, like. The smart scientists these days who are starting to explore consciousness studies understand that, like, you know and you've done this, you've worked in this sphere, like, if you really if you really take a moment to understand that the universe is the universe as beheld through consciousness, like, there's no other way of describing the universe than through the lens of consciousness. Like, all of it is life. It's all life. Any concept you have of the universe is a concept that is born of consciousness, born of life. Like, the entire unit, like, and this gets into the deep tantric teachings on cognizer, cognized, and active cognition. Like, the universe is, it's not a background object through which subjects walk. It is an agreement between subject, object, and active knowing, right? It's an agreement. It's a pulsing triangle. It's a womb space that vibrates with life, and this constant Shakti interplay between consciousness and what that is conscious of, and the act of conscious and the act of being conscious. And this, I had an opportunity to talk to a neuroscientist about a year ago who, like, totally gets this. And he says it's going to be increasingly talked about in scientific circles because, you know, like the whole scientific notion that you can somehow remove consciousness from the equation, you can somehow remove the subject from the equation. It's just impossible. So if it had to come to like, hey, you want to get into a scientifically based discussion about the nature of the universe being consciousness, you can. You can get into that discussion and you'll find that the universe is consciousness. But it's, at the heart of it, it's like, um, uh, there's a writer who I interviewed for the podcast named Anne Rowe, and she said something. She wrote a book about Orpheus, and she said something really interesting, which is that, oh, everybody in the modern world like poo poos animism, and then you go out for a walk in the woods and you take a wrong turn on the trail, and it starts getting a little dark outside, and people re-find animism within minutes. And they're like hearing the voices in the trees, and they're asking for help. They're voicing to the quote unquote universe, they're guide me and this kind of thing. It's like, you know we are not so far removed from animism than we think. And we also see animism pop up in culture in thousands and thousands of different ways. All of our kids' movies are animist. And then, like, at a certain age, you're like, oh, welcome to the real world, son. It's not actually like that. It's like, well, maybe we're the ones who need to reacquaint ourselves with the characters or the characters and creatures. Sorry, I went on a little
Yeah,
long
no,
there.
no, no. Yeah, I love that point that literally all the kids' movies, it's like, and if it's for the youngest kids, then everything talks, The Rock talks, whatever. It's slightly older kids, all the animals talk, and it's like, it is corresponding to their instinctively animist view. And the idea that some people might have is, well, we grow out of that delusion in which we're projecting our own nature onto everything. Yes, we do, but then there's an opportunity to discover the animism that really exists, right? The animate nature of things that is not simply a projection of our, anthropocentrism. And it seems to me that this is the big obstacle because, people think, oh, are we talking about, every tree is like a person, every rock is like a person, every river is like a person? No, because each of those so-called things is not even a thing. A tree is not a thing unto
Continuum.
itself. It's a particular combination of environmental factors. It's a confluence of environmental factors and not an object unto itself. And so everything that exists in nature is utterly relational, right? And in my own experience, the way in which we get in touch with if you want to say spirit, the spirit of the tree, the spirit of the river, the spirit of the stone, is by listening, really deeply listening and becoming quiet. This is why I think if you don't have a meditation practice, this is not going to be available because there's just way too much thought and projection of thought. But if you get quiet enough and really listen, then whatever we're talking about, I'm using these examples of the tree, the river, and the stone, each has its own character. It doesn't speak in human words. You're not having some, psychotic experience where they speak in human words. They speak, quote unquote, in their own way. They speak of everything that they're connected to, everything that they're embedded in. And just, so for example, with a rock, it's like, how does it land in your hand? How does it fit the shape of your hand or not do so? What is its character? What does it say very slowly and quietly of the millennia, or eons that gave birth to it, and so on and so forth. So it's like, I think anyone could potentially discover the animate nature of reality simply by slowing down, quieting down, and listening, and not centering their story of human significance and individual uniqueness as much as they habitually do.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Aboriginal writer named Tyson Yunkaporta talks about this, and he talks about um, listening for the signal of the land, and that signal, like you're saying, that voice is audible, and there's also a side to this that has to be expressed to modern listeners who just may not have had these types of experiences, which is that, like, in my case, for example, um I had some foundational experiences in India where what you can call animate forces, were so tangible and so palpable that you couldn't argue. Nobody in that room could argue with the fact that there was something there. And that's just simply a feeling that we don't, have very often in the modern Western world. So, when I experienced that, I wanted to find more, and I spent the better part of the next decade every time I was in India going to, um, small rural goddess temples and sites of transpossession and this type of animistic ritual. And there are things that, like, we can talk about kind of the faint voice that we hear, in the modern world when we're just starting to, reacquaint ourselves with nature. And then we can also talk about, like, you know, there are voices there are voices that proclaim themselves very loudly, let's put it that way. Like when you're in a space and a particular animate being is called, and the force of it entering the room is such that it knocks people over. And I've felt this myself in spaces where I wasn't looking to have it happen to me, and this is a side to it that I think that people, like, should know. Like, this exists, and it exists all over the world. It's happening in Brazil right now. It's happening in India right now. You know, like, the tangibility of you know the power of nature and the power of these types of forces and the existence of, what can be called spirit beings. Yeah, you may not be able to fully grasp it until you've had an experience where it's utterly and totally undeniable. But in those places where it's utterly and totally undeniable, if you've had that experience, it leaves you with no doubt that I mean, think about the amount of space that, Indian tradition spent, like the time and space it spends on spirit possession and on, you know, the um, the varying forces that move through bodies and what they do and this type of thing. And then you take that outwards to the ancient Greek traditions, and you take it outwards to the Yoruban traditions and Afro-Brazilian traditions, and what you start to understand is that there is an entire cultural language, cross-cultural language across the world, a context of working with particular forces, and those particular forces are actually really deeply tangible. They're really deeply tangible. It's just that we have architected a culture for ourselves where we don't get to feel them very often. So I mean, that's a big part of it too. And that's what, like, if you really look at it, like, I mean, that's what ancient Greek tradition was built on. Ancient Greek tradition, which ends up becoming eventually modern philosophy and this type of thing, but it is built on transpossession. It is built on, being seized by Apollo or seized by a nymph, or, taken into this state of rapturous consciousness. It's based on interaction with animate forces. And so, like, it's hard to overemphasize how much this is the substrate of global human experience, and it's really only in the past couple hundred years that we've ultimately gotten away from it. And to our detriment, I believe.
Yeah, and so one thing you're pointing to is that these animate forces are not only that which animates the observable features of nature, but also there are animate forces that either don't have bodies or don't have visible bodies. And I absolutely agree. I just think we make a mistake when we imagine that separate individuality or personhood is what's being attributed to them. It's
Mm.
like when you're lost in the cult of individuality, you imagine that's what everyone's doing, right? And you say, well, I don't believe in this spirit named so and so that supposedly possessed this person, because you're viewing it as if it's an individual entity with individual agency and individual personhood, and you're denying the reality of that. And you're right to deny the reality of that, but the problem is that you're not like even open to or conceiving of the possibility that these we could say non-corporeal animate forces are functioning on a different level
Mm.
than the one we conceive in our little minds of individual entities. So they are just as much embedded in their total environment, whether we call it psychic or anything else, as a tree is in its environment,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that gets to what you mean when you say being. Like, what is a being? A being is an agreement. Like you said before, it's like a confluence. It's a continuum. It's a relationship, and that relationship requires consciousness, right? I mean, it's all interwoven. The perceiver and the perceived, and their dynamic interaction. I mean, it's interesting because you go to like the ancient Ayurvedic texts and they will tell you very clearly, like, well, here's the symptoms when someone gets like, possessed by a yaksha, and here's the symptoms when somebody gets possessed by a Gandharva. you know, um, yeah, it's like it's nice to be possessed by a Gandharva in certain ways, but it can also have like particular side effects. But then you have to ask yourself, like, what is a yaksha and what is a Gandharva? And um, I mean, there's two sides to this. I think what you're saying is attributing too much solidity to like the individual character and isolated individualism of those beings can be kind of dangerous. But there's another danger too, which is that kind of the and you and I have talked about this before, the assumption that, well, they're all just in my head, like it's all just psychological forces and this kind of thing. That isn't exactly accurate either. No, we're in relationship with with a living ecology, and as participants in that relationship, you know, relational forces pool and congregate in different parts of the mandala in different ways, and I may be open to some and boundaried against others, and those beings themselves, as you're saying, are a confluence of environmental factors and this type of thing. Um, but that still calls me to a acknowledgement of their presence, as something other than just like, forces of my own psychology, for example. And I think that that's one of the gifts that traditional animism has to offer, is it takes us in to relational space that is outside of just, us as kind of the be all end all. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. I mean, that's crucially important. That you know, if people think that, oh, those guys who are experiencing this non corporeal animate force and calling it whatever Davy or something, they're just experiencing the projection of their own psychology or wishful thinking. That's completely delusional, because you and I and countless others have been in situations where we were predisposed not to believe, we were predisposed to be skeptical, and we were brought to our knees by
Mm,
the power of something
mm,
beyond our knowing, and that was explicitly not a feature of our psychology, that felt, in a way alien. Maybe that's too strong a word, right? Because it's utterly a part of nature at the same time, in the broader sense. So absolutely, absolutely agree. It's just that when we as humans tell stories about these experiences and give names and give histories, and this is the nature of this spirit and that deity and so on, we're narrativizing. That's what we do as humans. We narrativize things.
Mm.
And the fact that our narrativizing is based in our human psychology, in our collective psychology, that doesn't mean that the experience itself is. And that's pretty significant. And it seems to me that, like, the the most important thing we could call people to do, people like, you and I and others, what can we call people to? It's an opening to, or reverence of, appreciation of, the divine mystery. Like, if somebody can just start to get the sense that almost all of it is mystery, and that there's far more on heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your particular philosophy, right? That itself is a huge, huge step, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, where I turn to the descriptions of the goddess, where it says things like, all of time and space are merely her ornaments, and all that we could ever know of her and perceive are merely her ornaments. And that, I hope, I mean, for me, that's what connects me to that wellspring, that heart of reality that I want to be connected to, is the very understanding that, you know, we are dancing in her foot dust. And as we're dancing in her foot dust, like Ram Prasad says, we're like ants trying to grasp the moon. And we have to let that body of hers be unknown and mysterious and ungraspable. And so, we architect our practice and our traditions, we architect our ways of knowing in a way that hopefully allows us to, receive from that wellspring that is her, and receive from that fountain, and and alchemize it so that it benefits our lives and benefits the lives of those around us. And at the same time, we rejoice in the fact that she remains ultimately a mystery.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a beautiful place to end this never-ending conversation. Right.
Just the
Um,
beginning, really, but yeah, we
yeah.
should try to have it not be another year before we talk again. But,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga practices, guided meditations, and much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Paula Chamas. New episodes drop every other week. And may all beings benefit.